Hello, beautiful people, and thank you all for joining us today. Thanks very much as well to the guest for this afternoon or evening or night, depending on where you are, the inimitable academic agent who was kindly willing to come on this evening to talk to us about researching and the whole breadth of that. Hello, AA. How are you?
Good. Pleasure to be on. Semigod.
The pleasure is all ours. I have a little bit of boilerplate stuff to rip through in the beginning, so if you'll bear with me, I will knock that out. First off, everyone be aware that our guest this evening, I doubt there are many of you who don't know this, has all sorts of stuff available. There's Foundations of Politics. There is his recent book, The Populist Delusion, which seems to be selling very, very well. It's sold out with the first run almost immediately. There are links for all of this and more, his merch, his various channels, and the rest below in the video description. So please avail yourselves of those links and help him to wet his beak. Otherwise,
very pertinent to this stream. Foundations of Research. It's only £50.
yeah, for crying out loud. Absolutely. For my part, there are links below for my sci-fi story and for my book of poems. And you can follow this channel as well as the sister channel, A Safer Space. You can do that on Odyssey. You can do it here or BitChute, God help you. There's also Minds, there's Gab, there's Twitter, there's Telegram. And those links apply, I believe, for AA as well. Also, thanks very much to the Praetorian Chads who support my channel. All of the credit and none of the blame. I will be updating my damn intro slate here shortly. I finally got my file cabinet set up, so I think I'm done with the most immediate and pressing things of my own, so I can start to turn to the channel here soon. So thanks to everyone who's borne with me during this phase of moving. So I'm very, very interested in this subject because it is about far more than most people realize. AA, of course, knows this very, very well indeed. But for some of the troublesome trucks, who might be inclined to think that this is a dry subject about, how to get better grades in school or something, I want to emphasize that this is about a much broader set of skills, techniques, and goals. Let's say it's about a broader range of human activity. It's about how to make things with your mind. For those of you who would rather smash, it's also about how to effectively and methodically destroy things with your mind, how to discover things. So it's not about the kind of dull nonsense that most people associate with school or with essays. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to get to some of the things that even in school they will seldom teach you. I mean, if you get lucky and you have a PhD advisor who doesn't hate you, and that's rare enough, or seek to bind your feet like a Chinese courtesan intellectually, you might learn about some of the kind of things I hope we'll cover, the use of cards for references, flagging your books and these kinds of things. But the sort of research skills, at least in my experience, that really matter, they have to be learned. Which is to say that they're very seldom taught. So to me, it seems like we've got sort of the full range here, AA, from, sort of asking a question, deciding which question to ask, getting a sense of what's missing or what's wrong with the current picture or what to go looking for. Then there's the whole issue of how to find it, how to see the negative space. And then there's the business of organizing what you find as you're finding it, rather than having to do it later. Outlining composition, presenting your ideas, dealing with, for example, people who might be inclined to dissuade you from pursuing a particular path. And I think in particular, you'd be a person very well able to share some thoughts maybe on how to have the balls to just tell everyone that they're wrong. Without even a blush on your face. So how would you want to start, sir?
Well, the first thing to know is that until you start doing the research, you you probably don't know what the right question to ask is. You may have an idea, but you won't. The whole process of doing the research will start to refine that question down a little bit. You'll come to figure out that somebody somewhere along the line has at least made gestures towards making the sort of point that you want to make, which then alters the exact argument. So that's the first thing I would say, is that no research question survives first contact with the research. I would suggest. The second thing I would say is that I have found that trying to have as panoramic and as complete a view of an issue as possible, which you can do in a shorter amount of time than you might imagine, not only puts you in the kind of top percentile of the sorts of people who will know about this topic anyway, but will also put you in a position where you can actually start to spot where those gaps are that you were talking about in the first place. So, in a strange way, I would always start with the research first and then come to answer those questions second, because you're not going to know before you have contact with what is said. And I can get into some very specific ways of doing that if you want, but I don't know if you wanted to, before we get into that, have any more kind of broad comments at the start here.
Well, only one that occurred to me as you were speaking, and I certainly want to hear what you're going to move to next. But you sort of raised the whole point of specialization and increasing specialization, and once upon a time, from the idea of mastering the quadrivium and the trivium, all the way up to, I guess, the encyclopedic traditions. People like Diderot and D'Alembert. D'Alembert, I don't know. I can't pronounce French. Forget about it. But the point is that there was an ideal that people pursued, which was that there would be Catholic knowledge, which is to say universal knowledge, that a single person could attempt to understand everything. And that was sort of a goal, an aspirational goal for being a learned person. Whereas now, it's kind of like a type of insect that lives on the kind of moss that grows on only one type of tree and only on the northeast facing side during certain seasons. What my friend Tim used to dismiss as specialization is for insects. So given the way that academic and educational systems work these days, I wonder if you have any words on that whole business of specialization and how it can blinker and blinder, given that it would relate, it would seem, to your first point about trying to form an overall picture.
Well, what I would say is that yes, there is a place for specialization, of course, but it does mean, if you see all of the different branches of knowledge as this, different twigs coming off a branch, if you want, you're going to spend your entire life just on one bit of that, getting to know it better and better and better. And a lot of academia today is made up of some specialists of this nature, especially in the sciences because of the way they work, of course, but also in every other field as well.
And indeed, because they have to be to a certain extent. There's increasingly more information.
But I mean, this is also the case in some of the softer subjects as well. I'm not a historian per se. I just look at this one period of the Spanish Civil War, between these dates, and specifically, on the nationalist side, for example. Like, that's my topic. I just know everything there is to know about that one thing. Okay. However, I think that there is a set of techniques that you can use to get to know any field at all, even sciencey ones, right? Even ones that are way outside your kind of topic of expertise, if you want to put it that way. And if you put your mind to it, you can get to know what that field is. And you can get to have an overview of what the approaches are within that field, what the different camps are in that field, what the state of knowledge is in that field, what the broad consensuses are in that field. And in a strange way, you can know all about that field without actually being an expert on that field. And this is something I used to do when I worked as a conference producer, um, where wherein I used to put on events for a company that made events for financial technology engineer, like financial engineers, quants, people like this. Okay, now I don't know the first thing about financial engineering or about being a quant, but I know all about the dynamics of the industry. I know about what they care about. I know about what the different positions are in there, to the extent where I could still, I mean, I'm probably about 10 years out of date now, but I could still probably have a conversation on fintech with, someone who worked in and around that area, know what the issues are, know what their problems are. Um, and in a strange way, if you speak to all of the people across the different board, across the whole spectrum, you can actually start to see things that maybe even some of those people who are looking at the trees, if you want, or looking at the individual branches of the trees, they may miss them because you've got a broad overview of the whole space. Um, but it's not just that area; it's any area at all. And I think that that's something that I can do. And but I don't think it's unique to me. I think anybody who would take my basic approach to things could also do that. Yes.
And what is that secret that you would or is this where you say funny that you should ask foundations
Uh,
of research?
no. I think for a start, everything before you get into it looks like a mountain. Okay, it looks like a mountain, a great undiscovered country, and it looks too foreboding to get into. Right? It can be any topic in the world. Let's just take something that's people will readily understand, but is still quite daunting to most people. I don't know something like uh, Bob Dylan's career from 1960 to now. I mean, the guy's got what, like 60, 70 albums, different phases of his career, thousands of songs. It seems insurmountable, right? If you from a start of knowing nothing. Um, but in fact, once you really start getting into it, it's like, well, how many albums are there? What, like said, like what, 60? Like, you can know 60 things. Um, and then it's like, well, okay, what are the different, and then you can start getting into, well, who has written what on this topic? What are the different positions within that topic? What are all the different books written on this topic? Um, and, okay, you may end up with several lists worth of, let's say, anywhere between 60 to 100 things on each of one of those lists. But, in the overall scheme of things, if you put your mind to it, you can get to know that area extremely well, especially if you do nothing else in that period where you're doing if you're intensely focused on it. Um, so and that there are a few little cheats ways in to that can help speed up the process, for example. So uh, um, let's just pretend the only time you've got. Have you ever been to the British Library or the Bodleian or a reference library?
Yeah,
Semi-God, like
what's the one that's off the British Museum? It's got the reading room there.
yeah, the British Library. This is what I'm talking about. Yeah,
Yeah, I've been to that
yeah.
one.
Yeah, so in a library like the British Library, they have every book ever published. Okay, in Britain. Um, so if a book comes out in Britain, one copy is deposited there. It's a deposit library. The Library of Congress is also like this in America. Bodleian in Oxford. There's a few other ones. Australia's got one. These are just libraries who have one copy of every book. Okay, and you can't take books out of that library. You have to make a request. Okay, I need these books, and then some elves, some magic elves, go down into the dark dungeons, and after some hours, they come up with a pile of those books that you request. Okay, um, and I would suggest that no matter what the topic is, if you had a run of 5 or 6 hours in there, you could come out the other side, um, Um, and even if you don't encounter every single book on that, on those lists of, do you remember I was saying you'll end up with 3 lists of 100 things?
Hmm.
You should be able to read the 10 books that will give you those 3 lists. Does that make sense?
Right, the surveys and the overviews and the ones that you will turn to, as you of course know, because of the quality of their bibliographies.
Exactly. And usually, if a field is established enough, and invariably your field will be, there will be somebody, even if it's a very little known field, somebody will have done something. Okay. Um, there will be people who write those survey overviews, of the state of play and whatever that is. Um, Sometimes it will be like somebody will write a book, right? And you read the introduction to that book, and it's like, oh, he's writing this book in reaction to these 3 other books, and it's like, okay, so now we're building up a picture of a story of what has happened in this field. Loads of people thought this and that, but now this person thinks this, and they actually disagree over it, and there are 2 different camps. And you quickly realize that almost every field has areas of disagreement, camps, sides, and you start to map it out, whether you do it mentally or on a piece of paper or whatever. You start to build up a picture of what's going on. And it literally doesn't matter what the topic is. This is just true of everything I've ever looked at, including like economics, psychology, uh, sociology, psychiatry. I mean,
Tarot poetry.
yeah, tarot, whatever it happens to be. Like Mrs. AA has currently been doing a course on what do they call it? Psychotherapy, right? Stuff like ADHD and autism and things like this. These sorts of conditions. She's been doing a course on that, and she's been taking ages to write her bloody essays on it. And I keep on saying, listen, just give me a couple of hours and I'll help you do it. She's very resistant to that, obviously, because she wants to do the work herself. But I have noticed, in her work process, there have been all these different sides. In those debates, there are geneticists, there are biologists, there are psychiatrists, there are educationalists, and it's like, oh right, well, I now know there are at least 4 different camps in that area, and they compete for allocation of resources. Each one of them wants money from the government or money from donors, and they each have a little agenda there as well, and they each have a different way of solving the basic problem, and they have disagreements, and there's all sorts of there's all sorts of debates that go on in that space. Okay, now I don't really know the ins and outs of each one of those things, but just by knowing that fact that I've just given you, you're already like, if you take the total population, we're already in the top 10 percentile just by knowing that, because most people just don't know anything about the topic at all, right? So then, if I was really, if it wasn't just me looking over Mrs. A's shoulder, and if it was me doing the work, then you'd go into what actually goes on in each one of those 4 spaces. Then you start putting flesh on the bones. Then you start being able to articulate what each one of these camps says and thinks. What have been their findings? What are some of the facts they bring to bear? What are some of the big counter arguments they give to the other schools? And before you know it, once you flesh out those 4 pictures, well, now you've moved up from the top 10 percentile into maybe the top 5, top 3 percentile even, because we're getting more and more specialized in the way we do this without ever becoming that uber specialist who just hangs out one of those branches. Does that make sense to you, Semigo?
Yes, indeed, it does. It even suggests that that the very nature of that narrow focus is going to present them. I mean, I guess that's what you're saying. Present them with a number of difficulties in forming that overarching picture. That's kind of the forest for the trees point that you were making earlier. And what role would you say, if any, inspiration plays in this process? And by that, I mean very much the sort of difficult to quantify sense or an itch at the back of your mind, the intuitive sense that you've got to move towards this thing, that somehow it's calling to you. You don't know what it is. There was a guy from MIT who worked on the Apollo program I used to talk with, and he used to say, I quote, he would say, "There's a pony in there somewhere." Like there's a sense that there's a pretty prize for the kid who goes looking. That is very much a part of what I did and do, in terms of just figuring out where to go look that no one ever thought to look before. Like they didn't even know how to construe the field in such a fashion that they'd see that negative space or that white space. I wonder what your take is on the role of intuition on this, not to derail everything else, but you kind of said you're not a quant person.
No.
But there are certainly parts of your mind that incline in that direction in terms of, let's just say, your spreadsheets. So I kind of wonder if and how that coexists with any kind of intuitive sense of how to approach questions. Like, how do you work with your own unconscious?
I mean, one of the things I will say is that obviously everybody is different. I'm not very good and never have been very good at just being 9 to 5 and saying, well, I'm going to get up at 9. I mean, I had a colleague who was very regimented, like I get up at 9, I do some writing. He was a writer, he was a novelist, okay? And he works from 9 until lunchtime, then he has a cup of tea and does some emails, and then he goes back to his writing. And then he finishes at 5, and then he goes and plays with his kids or whatever, right? I can't do that. Never been able to do that. Never can work. At no point have I ever been able to work like that. Not even when I was working in a 9 to 5 office job like that producer's job I was telling you about. In fact, my way was always to, if I'm not in the zone, I can't work at all. So it looks to the outside world like I'm doing nothing. Like if if I had a manager looking on, he'd be like, what have you done for the past week? You've done fucking nothing. And it's because I'm just not in the right. I'm not in the, something. I'm not ready. Something's not right. I'm just kind of moving into the zone. But then there'll be a moment where something grabs me or something pulls me into the zone, and it's when that impetus hits. I then have to work quickly, to, gather my materials and do the work. Okay.
So it's like strike while the iron is hot, or you're like a surfer paddling out there waiting for the big wave, and when it comes, you have to drop everything and go.
Exactly. You have to strike while the iron is hot. However, this works differently if it's a small project or a big project. Okay. So a small project would be, I don't know, like back when I was working in that job, it would be like, well, find out all about this, low latency technology or whatever the fuck it was. Speak to these people and write a conference program. Or these days, it would be like when I made that slavery video the other day, right? That was just on a whim. I was reading a book by George Fitzhugh. I was like, oh, he's making some interesting points here, but he's making them in kind of a 19th century kind of, Carlylean manner. What if I could stick some data on that and really have a look at, whether the arguments this dude is making stand up to scrutiny, especially if I did a kind of modern day comparison to it by working out the inflation difference and all of that. And that's a kind of, I kind of had an idea I would make that video. Didn't really know what I would find until I started on it. And I probably worked for 10 hours straight on that video. Mrs. AA stopped me recording, which fucking infuriated me. But I still stayed up till 5 a.m. And then I woke up the next day, AAA had gone to nursery. And when the coast was clear, I did the final bit, which was record it and get the damn thing out. So from start to finish, that slavery video took about, let's say, 12 hours to make, from conception to getting it out, right? And that is me working in a in a kind of white heat, if that makes any sense. And I had to do it like that because if I hadn't done it, if I'd waited until today, I just wouldn't have done it. I'd have been
You
like,
wouldn't
oh,
care still.
I mean, it would have grayed out in my mind. It would have just been like, oh, one of those things that I thought briefly about and it gone. So I had to grab it. I had to grab the bull by the horns when it came to that. Now, with that, I kind of had an idea of like, well, I knew a few little things. I knew that those slave narratives are out there, for example. But then it was a question of like, well, we can ask some real questions like, what did slaves eat? Where did they live? What was the size of their dwellings? Are those dwellings still there today? And are there pictures of them? How do they compare with where people live today? What are the costs of where people live today? So these are like really easy questions to answer. And, sometimes you don't have to look that far. Especially if you know how to use things like JSTOR, which is a very, very useful tool for a scholar. You're familiar with JSTOR,
Yes,
Semigog?
yes, yes.
Or if you, there's also this thing called Z Library, which has got an article section that basically doubles up as JSTOR. I use that a lot these days. You can find books on there as well. And it was like, oh, brilliant. Oh, there's a paper from 1905 that actually breaks down and lists all of the costs that a slave owner had. Fucking brilliant. That saved me a day of research right there, So it's just like, well, you can just build up a quick picture very quickly. And, that was a quick video. So it was a bit rough around the edges. I didn't have, I didn't go to the ends of the earth to say, well, oh, here are 15 different scholars who have, this one's got this view and this one's got that view. If I really, really wanted to make that into a big project, I'd have to then, spend days and weeks building up that big picture that I was telling you about before. But it didn't need it. The little video just needed some factoids. It didn't need the, oh, this person says this person says that. It didn't need all of that. So there is also the question of scope. What does the project actually require? That project didn't require oh, this person said this person said that, because it was just a quick YouTube video, right? It was just oh, what if slaves had it better than us, type thing. Which
Right,
is,
and go on, sorry.
yeah, go on, Sammy, go. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say that it seems to me that there are two things that come to mind. The first is that you have to be able to recognize what level of research and findings. Like you said, this is just a quick type thing, right? You didn't have to go and teach yourself Renaissance Italian in order to be able to access the, primary sources. You were able to work from secondary literature as well as testing it against, for example, the slave narratives that were recorded in the U.S. This kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So you did it with secondary literature, but you essentially came across this point that you were reading. And to me, it sounds as though you just said, let's just go stress test this, right? So you said, yeah, these are interesting points. I'm inclined to believe that they're accurate, but I'm going to go ahead and go through a few exercises with hard numbers and economics in order to verify it. So really all that was happening there was that you just went and stress tested a thing that interested you somewhat. And that exercise in and of itself, with a little bit of elbow grease thrown in, yielded work product that you were able to turn over and then move on to your next thing. So that's the first point I want to raise. My buddy Tim told me that you're supposed to sell shit. And I said, well, that sounds horrible. And he says, yeah, but you have to understand it as being something that you've digested and you're done with, which is the point at which you can share it with others. And he says, think about a deer eating from a tree with fruit, and then it walks through the forest and craps and like fertilizes all these other things with what's left over.
Yeah.
So that's point one.
Yeah, I will say, though, I just want to say very quickly is that even though this was a bit rough around the edges by my own admission, I still did a lot of things along the way that may not occur to a lot of other people. Like, for example, this is just one example. I don't know how many people would have gone to the lengths of finding cornmeal prices listed in the 1890 census backdated to 1851 and then worked out what that is.
How many loaves you could get. Yeah.
How many loaves you could get and what that is adjusted for inflation. Like, to me, that sort of thing is second nature, but a lot of people, they didn't bother to do that. Do you know what I mean? Or, I don't know. How much does a normal person spend on how much was a normal person spending of their wages on food back then? All of these things. It was just like, well, sometimes it's about those little questions. What are the right ones to ask? And I'm not saying that I always get it right. I'm just saying that if you do those things quickly and automatically, you'll be adding a level of detail that most people wouldn't bother to go to, including some of my sources. That economist from 1905 hadn't bothered to go and do that, for example, but that's by the by.
Indeed. So yeah, one point then, just to underscore that first one, is that if you're wise about it, it would seem that the various stages of what you produce can be pushed out there and monetized. And indeed, anyone who's got proper academic training, or even half-assed as I have, they understand that, because of course you would at first, develop your ideas and then, begin to do some preliminary research, which would make it into the specialist literature in periodicals. And then eventually you could gather those together if you did it sort of the standard way. And, when you publish your book, you can say, chapter 4 first appeared in the Journal of Duhicus, Mm-hmm. So there are ways to take what you're researching as you go and turn it out, which keeps you moving, keeps you publishing in the publish or perish paradigm, which does seem to apply to some extent in the world of quote-unquote content on YouTube. So that's an important thing to understand, is that, it might not be ready for you, but if it's self-contained in the way, for example, your little exercise with, and I don't mean that dismissively, of course, your small exercise with slavery was, if it's self-contained enough, then you've got something ready to turn out and then and also refer to in future as your own little encapsulated unit of research here or there, because you can then go refer to your old script where you gathered the numbers and the rest. Anyway, but again, for inspiration, in some respects, there's inspiration qua inspiration, but it also seems to be that motivation is itself a kind of inspiration, and you're very sensitive to your own nature as regards whether or not you have the motivation to do it. And I wonder what you think about whether or not that relates to, I think, what could safely, not uncharitably, be called your contrarianism. I myself find that I'm particularly motivated to research and produce things when someone pisses me off with their stupidity. And anger with others would seem to be a kind of motivation. And I think it's fair to say sometimes motivation, if it is an inspiration, it can double for it, like methadone instead of heroin, to help keep you moving. Do you think that contrarianism is maybe not a bug, but a feature in some cases, and that it can help a scholar to move forward depending on their personality?
Yeah, I mean, especially if you're trying to rebut someone or something like that, you can put together. I mean, I haven't done that in some time, but if you remember, I did my 4-part series against Edelman and Sitch. Do you remember my 4-part reply?
Oh yes.
That was a hell of a lot of work I put into those videos. And again, it was in a very constricted amount of time, and it was just because, they pissed me off. So yeah, whatever your motivation can be. And very often in academia, it is because somebody's trying to rebut somebody else, but when it comes to a larger project, you see all of these things, they work for smaller projects. When it's a bigger project, like a book, for example, like I'm working on a book at the moment called The Prophets of Doom. Okay. I've just been reminded that the deadline is in December. This is terrifying because I haven't written a single sentence yet. Semi-agog.
Yeah, but you once wrote a book in like 3 days, didn't you?
Right.
I mean,
but the thing is that this will be my 8th book, but I always go through the same process. I have a moment where I'm like, oh my god, I'm never going to finish this. I'm not going to be able to pull it off this time. But somehow the rabbit always comes. Somehow, whether it's in a week's time or in a year's time, you just kind of back yourself to do it, and you will end up, somehow or another, the inspiration does come. It hits you, but when it strikes, you have to know when to take it. And also, by the same token, when it's not there, I have never tried to force it, because I know the stuff I will produce is not good. I had some advice once, never don't churn. You shouldn't churn. But if you feel like you're churning, then you're not going to do good. Then you're not going to make good material. It shouldn't feel like a chore. It should just be something that comes. Something that comes. And the weird and terrifying thing about that is that I've still yet to figure out what it is that triggers a zone or not. I just have faith that it will come, Um, uh, but what I was saying with that is that when you're writing a book, which is a much, much bigger piece of work, um, you have to be realistic about what's possible. Okay. So in the early phase, even before you get to research, there is what I like to call the gathering process. You actually have to gather the materials. Okay. You have to, which starts off with, well, you have to know what you're looking for, and then you have to actually acquire them. Which increasingly, I can't be bothered to go to libraries anymore. I just buy them off Amazon. I'll literally just buy hundreds of books off Amazon that I need. And we're in a blessed time at the moment where a lot of libraries are selling off their stock, and they end up on my shelf here. I don't know if that will always be the case, but
No.
I actually need. I mean, one it's actually part of my process where I have to start gathering, and I have to start gathering, and you have to. That also comes on impetus. You have to be in the zone to gather, right, and then to know what you're going to buy, to order it all, and have it all come through. And then there's a big one, which is like stuff from human mental books. But you know, um, then you, this is something else that I can explain well to people, but because people are like, "Do you read all those books from cover to cover?" I'm like, "Well, not really. I kind of, because a lot of them are secondary reading, right? I kind of like, well, I know I'm going to write on something. Let's say it's Carlyle's Heroes and Hero Worship. Okay, let's just pretend that's the topic. I've got literally 30 books on Carlyle here, pamphlets, essays, scholarly books that came out in the 40s, recent ones, ones that came out in the 19th century. I've acquired all this material on Carlyle. Each one of them will have a take on Heroes and Hero Worship. I can now basically process all of those books for their thoughts on Heroes and Hero Worship. Okay. You don't need to read them all to process them for Heroes and Hero Worship. Does that make sense?
Yes, indeed. And a lot of people don't understand that. They seem to think that you have to have read every book from cover to cover, which, and anyone who actually has a library and focuses on such things, you can dismiss it outright, because even reading a book once isn't enough. 10 years later, you're going to have to come back and reread again. Sometimes there are books that you need to read 3 times if you want to get what's in them. And the collatio, the idea of bringing together, cross-referencing the various elements, is something that you can do across, 6, 10, 15, 20 volumes during a project like you're talking about.
People are saying I'm roboting. Is that true?
You did briefly there for a bit. All we lost, though, was probably the equivalent of a sentence or two before you mentioned reading books from cover to cover.
Right. Fine. Okay. So yeah. I mean, and in a strange way, when you do that, you pick up a huge amount through osmosis as well, though, right? If you have read a relevant, let's just say, 8 to 10 pages across 40 different books on one topic, you start to see things that most people who haven't done that see, right? And then let's say you move on to, I said I was writing on Heroes and Hero Worship. Well, Carlyle also wrote another book, and maybe I also now need to write something about I don't know, past and present, I can go back to all of those books to see what they have to say about past and present. And then you'll start to be like, oh, hold on a second. This guy really was on a different page. This guy really was with him. This guy was against this guy. Oh, interesting. He mentioned him and he mentioned him. He mentioned him and he mentioned him. This thing that all of these four guys mentioned is obviously really important, and you just start to build up a picture, and once you've done that for a day, it kind of just seeps in through osmosis, if that makes any sense. You just kind of pick these things up, and so it is with all topics, I would suggest.
It also it occurs to me this might be a good spot just to ask quickly your attitude on the forming of one's professional library. I've been going through my vicissitudes in getting my, I don't know, 12, 15 tons of books into my storage building. They're still in boxes. For me, it always stood out. There's an old line in the old grimoires, the magical texts, and there's one line that says, when you're preparing for a spell, and they say, buy a black egg without haggling. And the basic idea is, first off, where the hell are you going to find a black egg, right? Which means you're looking for something rare. But if you do find one, buy the fucker without haggling, And I'm sure there are many occasions when you found the collected works of so-and-so, and you just said, well, damn it, I'm going to have to take it in the neck because I need this. In order to build the reference library that you require. So I don't know, that occurs to me, sometimes you just have to bite the bullet and do it, So in addition to buying the books and emptying your bank account and causing your different floors of your house to collapse, you'll need to buy a hand truck as well. But do you have any thoughts on the whole thing of building and forming your library?
Yeah, I mean, it really, because the thing is that if you do this enough, you'll end up with a shitload of books, as I've got, and you just have to keep on buying more shelves, I guess. I mean, I don't know where else to, I don't know where else to say, but I also make a distinction between primary and secondary texts. I don't know if you know. So I've talked a lot about doing secondary reading, but there's also the business of the primary books, right? So in each of those cases I just mentioned, obviously you need the heroes and hero worship and past and present before you can have all the secondary texts on them, right? So that's something else, because I think a lot of people who don't do any research, all of their texts would be primary. You don't they wouldn't occur to them to buy a secondary text. But in some cases, the primary text could also be it's not necessarily fiction; it's non-fiction. So I've got a whole book on Austrian economics. I've got a whole library section, a whole shelf, which is only economics books. But they're not all primary economics books. Some of them are books about Mises, whereas some of them are books by Mises. Does that make sense? So, yeah, I mean that's just something else to consider, I guess. I've got another section which is just books on Shakespeare. Well, obviously Shakespeare only wrote 37 plays, so all of that is secondary, right? And anyway.
Yeah, the Yale Shakespeare or whatever is like a one single whopping volume. And that's it for the primary sources, unless you want to get into correspondence or some of the other playwrights and things. But by going after the other things, not only secondary research that gathers together and synthesizes information available on the various primary sources and what people think about them, but as you said, for example, a book on Mises, not because you necessarily need to psychologize your author, but the context and the issues they confronted in their own life story can very often shed, important light. So I guess the main thing with the library is that however you form one, once you do, it's a thing that reveals your own journey and your own areas of interest. would love going over to a party at somebody's house and everyone would be chatting and I just wander off with my drink and look at their books because it's like they've thrown their skirt up over their head. You can tell most of the things, or many things certainly, about them.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, and I'm just trying to think of what what mine might look like if you put all of the books I've got. And I
Well,
think
it depends on whether you showed the ones behind the locking cabinet door, which I love.
but I think you'll see that a lot of my library um are built up around some topic or other, right? So I've got that Shakespeare shelf, which is obviously built from research I had to do for books I wrote on Shakespeare, right? The economic shelf is basically stuff I had to acquire to write my book on economics, which came out a couple of years back. I've got an elite theory shelf, which people have seen, which is all the secondary literature on Moscow, this populist delusion that's just come out. Um, so that's like one way of building up a library. But I've also got much more general reading. I've got a shelf there which is just like books by Peter Hitchens and Douglas Murray and just read Caldwell and different the sort of random reading that everybody has, right? Um, and to me that's almost like a kind of free for all leisure library, if that makes any sense, versus these much more specialist topic areas that I've got into for one reason or another. Um, I wrote a book a couple of years back that had to go into evolutionary psychology, so I've got a whole section on evolutionary psychology. Um, you know, Secondary reading around moral foundations theory and people like David Sloan Wilson, and this is all its own area, right? And it's just the way of getting into those things means that it's more than just a cursory interest in them. It's a kind of it's a it's a it's a specialist interest without being that specialist out on the branch. It's a kind of 5% specialist rather than a 0.1% specialist.
Right, and then you have the piles of books that, for me, they always go in a box marked miscellaneous, and you know that they're going to be consigned to some nether shelf, and because they haven't fit into the rest of the framework of my interests, and to therefore have their own shelves related to this period of research or this book that was produced, like you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So is there anything else you wanted to add on libraries? Because I also wanted to ask you again about this idea of being willing and able, which might touch on contrarianism again, to tell the truth and shame the devil. To just point right at the emperor and say that not only is the emperor wearing no clothes, but he's got a tiny little pecker. There's that is not a thing that you are encouraged to do in academia, as best I can tell. Especially, it increases once you get to masters, and it goes through the roof with PhD programs, which seem to be all about abusing and crushing the spirit of whomever participates in them. How did you come by your contrarian nature in this respect? And for those who don't have one, because I myself have always had one, I didn't have to develop the ability to think that they're full of shit. I just looked at them and it was apparent to me. Could you offer any thoughts on this, and in particular, how people can be encouraged? I hesitate to say this because some people shouldn't be encouraged to trust themselves, but for those who have that that's a sense that something's wrong, but don't yet have the juice to just stand up and say no, and to trust their own instincts and to pursue some path that they're dissuaded from pursuing.
Well, I mean, if you're actually in academia, there's three ways you can go about your research question, right? You can say this bunch of people have been doing this for the past 10 years, or the past 20 years, and it's become an orthodoxy, and it's time to overturn that. so you can just come out against the orthodoxy, right? Which is a pretty bold thing to do in your PhD, but it's still not, you know, it's still done, right? People still do that. Or there's another way you can go is to say, I kind of like this work that these people have been doing, but they've got a few little bits and bobs wrong. So I'm going to write a corrective to that, right? So you can write in the corrective mode. It's just like, yeah, this has been good stuff, but you've got these few bits wrong. I'm going to put that right in my work here. Okay. In fact, sorry, there's 4 ways you can go. There's another mode as well, which I'll get onto in a second. The third is, here's a movement that's currently happening, and I'm going to pitch my wagon to that, and I'm going to just do like more stuff in that mode. And frequently it's like, oh, all of these people have been doing this, but they haven't done this one thing. So I'm going to continue their good work by, I'm going to continue their work by just applying it to this one other area over here, which nobody else has done yet, right? And then there is the fourth thing that people can do, which is that nobody's ever worked on this ever, and I'm going to be the first one, which is not unheard of, but is quite difficult to do, especially in science, I'd imagine. Right,
and probably the most rare. Whereas it would seem to me that the third option of just, my buddy Tim used to call it horizontal thinking, right? You have vertical thinkers who make leaps and go somewhere, right? And then you have horizontal thinkers, and the vast body of academia seems to fall there, where someone over to the left dug a hole and found something, and someone over to the right dug a hole and found something. So they're going to dig, they're going to draw a line between the two of them and dig a hole in between them.
Yeah. But you see, I mean, if you look at my PhD is based on my first book. There's a whole set of kind of diagnostic stuff I did where I sum up what was, and I map out the terrain, and then I say, like, here's why they were wrong, right? And I think that if you're a fairly careful scholar, the academy will be fine with that, because you're kind of you have to be able to summarize their arguments almost better than they can before you counter them. Okay. What tends to happen is that scholars are quite timid at the start of their career, and then they fight a bit more when they're older. But then, unfortunately, because they're older, they're less careful, and they don't do that kind of good work. They're less diligent. Does that make any sense? So, I think what I did was a little bit different, in so much as I was extremely diligent, but I was also quite fighty when I was very young. But a lot of disciplines are actually moved forward by young scholars who have a bit of fight in them, who are nonetheless still like technically good. Does that make sense? So you can be you can be respectful but fighty. So going against a certain orthodoxy does not necessarily mean you're making yourself some sort of pariah, because you can do it in such a way that starts a dialogue, right?
Rather than shuts one down forever, as I discovered, because I came from the outside without a clear sense of how social the entire structure is, and how tender the egos are, and how ferociously people will kick back. So I came from the outside and approached scholars directly about things I took issue with in their work, and they were just like, "Fuck off." Yeah, so it would seem that keeping a civil tongue in your head has value there too.
Yeah.
Well, so it would seem that quite a bit of this is about project management too. I mean, when you really think about it, it seems like a specialized application of project management. And, many people will get some experience with that from the corporate world or whatever. But I think it's missing for a lot of people. They don't they don't understand how to look at something in terms of the overall effort, the delivery date, the milestones, so to speak, along the way, that you have to clear within certain time periods in order to have it all come together. The need to herd some cats to bring people online if you need help from others. Is there anything you would want to say regarding sort of that overall picture?
Yeah, which is that it everything is more achievable when you break it down into smaller chunks, right? So a chapter, I think most scholars will think, well, this book is this many chapters, and to write one chapter, I need to do this, right? So you'll think, well, if I'm going to stay on target, by this date, I'll have written this many chapters. So, and if anybody does a PhD, that tends to be how the PhD is structured, around finishing chapters by certain dates, and then having leaving enough time to revise the whole book, right? So, yeah, I mean, to write this book in December, I should have written about half the chapters already. So I'm very behind on this Prophets of Doom book, but it'll come. It'll come. I wouldn't recommend leaving it as late as I have, though, if you've never written a book before. I'm just,
Yeah.
I'm just kind of, I'm just waiting until I have a clear run, basically, and when the fancy takes me. But you'll see. I mean, you'll see. I have to. Sometimes it's about clearing a reminder of other stuff, and you'll start to get to know when I'm doing that, because I'll start doing things like making weird kind of music compilations on my secondary channel, or playing computer games and things like that, because that's me trying to find the right mental space to actually do some work. You have to sometimes you have to kind of detoxify by doing other stuff, right?
Yeah, that's that was another technique from my friend Tim. He would talk about loading the forebrain with all the information that you need to chew on, so to speak, that you need to digest. And it's very much like advice my mother used to give me. She's like, if you're in a bad mood, go to sleep. Wake up, something will have sorted itself, and you will at least have the opportunity to have a different perspective on it. Well, what my friend Tim would do is simply read an enormous amount of material across the discipline or the subject, and then he would just stop and he'd read trash fiction. He's like, I need to give something to my intellect to chew on other than this, so that I don't muddy the water, so that my unconscious can begin to chew on it, and it will spit some insight up later. So and I mean, when he said trash fiction, I mean, he was reading like Louis L'Amour and Nora Roberts. He'd even read romance novels, and he'd be off on one side, like analyzing the structure that makes women's romance novels successful. And then after he'd done that for a time, he could turn back to the other subject, having allowed his mind to work on these other things. Do you have any thoughts on working with others?
Yeah, I can't do
it. Yeah, full stop.
The only way I've worked with others is as a contributor to a book, where it's just like, you have to write a chapter by this certain date. I can do that. I have never co-written anything. I just can't do that.
And why do you think that is? If I may ask.
I don't know, to be honest. I mean, I think that part of it is that I know I can back myself. I don't know if I can back someone else. I don't know how many academics you've met. Like, I never miss a deadline. I get things in on time. Most academics are terrible. They make excuses. They don't get things done. They're unreliable.
So it's like you have enough challenges to deal with without throwing another person.
Yeah, so I don't like so that's one headache I can't be dealing with. Is that then it's like, well, how the hell do you co-write something? I don't understand that. It's either my sentence or it's yours, So I just I feel like that whole group collaborative effort thing is something that's become more prevalent, and I'm distrustful of it. I think it's maybe even inherently feminine, semiagog. I think it comes out of the social sciences. That's the culture in the social sciences more, and there may be good reasons for it, but I'm distrustful of it. I don't. I speak with my own authorial voice. I rely on my own research. I don't. I don't like. And if I did work as part of a team, each person would have their own specific job, and so there would be a very firm division of labor. I'll own this bit, you own that bit.
Right, build the Chinese walls into the organization to keep everybody from stepping on each other's dicks. Yeah, I
Yes.
tend to agree with you with the problems that come with that, because I find very often it's a way to create cover, a way to avoid responsibility. And I've often mentioned this in my own streams. It robs from you one of the most important things that you need, which is, especially if there's a failure involved, because the one thing that can redeem a failure is the ability to look back at it, see what went wrong, who was responsible for it, and correct it. And whenever I've done, with one exception, whenever I've done collective efforts with people, I found that whenever there was something screwed up, you could never figure out what's going on, because everyone, played the game of dodging blame. And so the one thing that could have made a failure quite valuable even that has been taken from you, because everyone's like, what? I didn't, he did. What? Huh? So I tend to dislike it too, though I should add, of course, it's like the Newton quote, one must stand on the shoulders of giants to see far. You are working with other people diachronically across time, in the sense that you've entered the conversation, you've acquainted yourself, as you just talked about quite explicitly, with the discourse thus far. Like that academics talk about the great conversation. It just seems that you are skeptical of the idea of synchronically, at the same time on this project, working with others.
Yes. Although I will say I've been a bit impatient in my. I don't tend to stick around for the conversation either. Which is to say, like, right, I've said my bit now, on to the next thing, type thing. So I have tended not to like people now are replying to things. Bearing in mind it's 2022. My first book came out in 2012. There are people who are still continuing that conversation now, publishing stuff today, right? Maybe not realizing that I just don't even give a shit about that conversation anymore. I've moved on to. Well, I mean, my last book was absolutely nothing to do with that first book, right? And
Right. You're like Bowie refusing to play changes.
exactly like Bowie. That's exactly right. I'm now fed up of glam rock. I'm doing something else.
Right.
Which
Put
is
on your blue suede shoes. Yes.
Exactly. But it's not just my own voice though, because you got to remember that in each one of those things, I have acknowledged what everybody else has said, and I've said, well, here's why I disagree with this, and here's why I agree with that. And in some cases, I don't disagree with anything. Like in Populist Delusion, I was basically doing a different thing. I was saying, here's some very important stuff that guys from the past said. You should also consider what they said. The end. So you don't always have to be that confrontational, or your job as the writer is not always to be original, right? Sometimes it's just like, well, these guys back here were right. Nobody listened to them. They should have. The end. So you can be more. It doesn't have to be some grandiose thing. You can actually have quite a small goal, which can have big consequences, but it's still like quite a humble little goal. More people should consider elite theory, for example. It's not that big a
Right.
goal. Yeah.
looking at the entire structure, and you'll find that it's really maybe just one column down near the basement where you could place your charges and bring the whole thing down, you know, with that focus and that attention. But it requires the overarching picture, you know, which people seldom are aware they should do or have the energy to do. Well, here's the thing that I'm particularly interested in. If I'm not keeping you for too long.
No, yeah, okay,
Well,
go on.
okay. And this is the various techniques used by scholars in the course of their research in order to organize it. So, you know, one of the old ones that was a big thing before the digital age was cards. You know, so you'd have a given book, and you know it would sometimes be the cards would act like a flag. You know, now they've got the little post-it notes, and you know I've seen, you know, this one French chick I dated who was an academic, you know, Sorbonne educated or whatever, and she had little flags for each of the subjects that she wanted to cross-reference, and she did it by color. That didn't work for me because before I started reading, I didn't know what buckets it would all eventually need to go into, you know. But you can have, for example, cards that you place in your books with notes. You can flag your books. I take it further, and I'm very much a proponent of escaping, as some who watch my channel will know. I'm very much a proponent of escaping from the line. Everything is sequential. As you read the line of text, as you flip the pages, as you write in something like Microsoft Word, you're scrolling up and down along a line. And so, you know, your ability to cross-reference things that you think about it is limited by what you can put on a line and how much of that line you can look at once. You know, whereas other types of relationships can become apparent if, for example, you put together big ass magnetic dry erase boards and put your cards up in clusters or in wheels or in, you know, overlapping circles or whatever. So I guess that's kind of pointing to a couple of angles, you know, like how you capture the insight as you're proceeding in such fashion that you can do something with it, you know, whether it's flags or cards, and then whether or not you yourself have any kind of meditative process where you chew on the things. Like a lot of people do it in their mind, and you know, some people do it sub or unconsciously. For my part, it's some of that, but I find, for example, for me, that it helps to have it all on a board where I can arrange it outside of the shape of a line, and it has to be bigger than a screen. You know, I like something that's, you know, like 10 feet across and 8 feet tall, and I can pace around the room and walk up close to it and walk back and see how the shapes interlock and think about a new way. You know, do you have any of these tricks, whether it be post-it notes and cards in your books or follow-up sessions? I mean, does it end up on the back of a cocktail napkin? Is there anything you do with escaping the line or using graphic space?
Well, one thing I'll say is that I never make any marks in any books. I never use post-it notes. I never use markers. All of my texts are completely unscathed in that manner.
Unsullied.
And I have made one annotation in my entire life, and it was underlining 2 lines of Paradise Lost. You know, the mind is its own place. Make a hell of heaven a heaven of hell. You know that line? I underlined that with my fountain pen. That's the only annotation I ever made. For some reason, I just don't work that way. What I tend to do is I will take down quotations. Sometimes it will be on. It used to be much more back in the old days. I used to do it by hand, but now I will just on Word. I'll put a heading for the book, and I will just take down the quotation and the page number, and that's it basically. And I'll take like all of the ones from this book, all the ones from that book, and then if I have a plan, later on I can marry up numbers to those individual quotations. Oh, that's one for the intro. That's one for later on. That's one for this chapter. That's one for that chapter. but realistically, I will only have them for individual chapters. So let's just go back to the idea that I'm going to write a chapter on Carlyle. All of those 40 books, I would take whatever is worth taking from those books, have quotations from all of those books, and then as I'm writing my chapter, I would know, well, around this time, I'm going to bring in this guy. Around that time, I'm going to bring in that guy. And I can't really quite describe how it works, because when you write the thing, this kind of lattice, this patchwork of quotations and references just kind of merges with the main text, and the final thing becomes a chapter. And there's no, like, I don't really have any guidance on how that bit of it works, but that's the basic process. I've got the quotes first, and I know I'm gonna be using them at some point, and then the business of writing it happens pretty quickly. Then the main bit is research, and the writing is fast. Yes.
Right. Well, now, if I may, I want to respond to the people in the chat, the troublesome trucks, talking about how it's a terrible sin to mark a book. If that is your approach, fine, they're your books. And I certainly loathe. I mean, words can't even really capture how much I despise people who just sit there with a book and take a ink pen and just endlessly draw lines under shit that they're reading. So the whole book is just nothing like but underlining the entire book, as though that somehow it shows that they read it. So yeah, there's some of that is repulsive. But the idea of marginalia, and for my part, I do lightly penciled in the margins, which allows me to return to these resources to see how I thought about them the first time that I read through them. And I have fine handwriting, and I have fine marginal notes, and it's my damn library. And it is a tradition that is thousands of years old, so everybody can kiss my ass.
There have actually been books written on 18th century marginalia in Shakespeare texts. And it's really interesting, because it's like, well, what did they note down? What were they interested in? And it can give you all sorts of interesting clues. For example, Machiavelli's The Prince was obviously a forbidden text, right? And it circulated almost on like a kind of black market. It was one of those open secrets, like nobody admitted to having a copy of Machiavelli, but everybody had one, right? What was the notes? What were they interested in? And it was really interesting. There's like really weird things, like lots of the marginalia was people correcting Machiavelli's Latin, his grammar and things like that.
Right.
They had nothing to say about certain passages. They were really interested in his strange atomism, for example. Like, he was into Lucretius, so he had this kind of atomistic attitude towards the universe, which is a very minor part of Machiavelli's thinking, right? But there was marginalia on that. They found it really interesting, whereas some of the more controversial stuff, nothing at all, right? And you just wouldn't know that if those marginalia wasn't there. So,
and back in those days, they actually had ample margins, which would allow you not only to be able to plug in extensive marginal notes, but you could actually see the text rather than having your thumb over half the letters the entire time.
They also used to do this. They used to do this thing. I can't remember what they called it. Was it minuscule or something? They used to draw a little finger. It's like a little.
Yeah, that's where index comes from. Index means to point. Yeah.
It's like this little pointing finger, and it's really interesting. They used to literally just draw it in, and they all had their own version of this little pointing finger. So
yeah, you can see a survival of some of those sorts of things in editor's marks. Where they'll cross something out, then change their mind and write stet, for Latin, let it stand. So those marginal notes show an interaction with the text, and you can also see it with shorthand. with things like Turonian notes. So it's a fascinating
Yeah.
subject in and of itself.
One thing I'll just very quickly say about processing a book for research purposes, okay? Because there's a difference between reading a book for pleasure and processing it for the purposes of research. Most non-fiction books have a very specific structure where they lay out their thesis in the introduction, and then they reiterate that thesis in the conclusion. And the chapters in between are case studies in which they demonstrate their thesis. Right? Now, most of the time, I mean, it really depends what your purposes are, but most of the time, you'll either go to a book because you want its main thesis, or you'll go to a book because you want some information in one of those case studies. Right? And just knowing that makes it easier to process a book, uh, you know, for what you need it for, which is to find out about something, right?
Yeah, it's kind of like the old thing about a novel. I think maybe it was Ambrose Bierce who said it, that a novel is a short story padded. And if you know that there are going to be these key things, especially with the older scholars who paid attention to such things, that they'd have thesis statements at the beginning and they would be laid out and there would be an order. You really can, if you approach it in the way you're talking about, distill the book down to its core elements and discover that it's really just a page outline.
I mean, Sartre's got a book which he wrote in a cafe famously called Being a Nothingness, right? I mean, really, being a nothingness could be like one side of A4. Right? I mean, in terms of the actual substantive idea, isn't it? It didn't need to be like 600 pages long. And if you're interested in the idea itself, then that is something else to consider too. Yes.
It's like, yeah, just watching something where they're making fun of 1911 pistols, and it's like everybody who does a video on 1911 pistols and what their advantages are, they could just, come, hello, welcome to the thing. 1911s have a good trigger. Thank you, goodbye. Yeah, it's there's a lot of nonsense packed around it because people want to make it seem like more than it is. Sort of like me when I'm speaking in a way that is not terse. And for people who simply have no background in it, if you're just starting from scratch, there's a book, I believe it's Mortimer Adler. It's called How to Read a Book. And
Yes,
for someone like AA,
got-
that's just kind of like, you know all of this. But for people who have no exposure to such things, it can be very, very helpful.
I mean, I've just got a book here, just on my desk. It just happens to be on my desk. Patrick J. Buchanan, The Death of the West, right? Now, we've already got an idea of what this book is about, okay? It's a famous book. In fact, somebody's actually, because this was secondhand, somebody has, it's interesting, somebody's written in the margins. Somebody's underlined things. I'll give you an idea of the sort of thing this reader has written in the margins. Ethnic minorities already constitute 40% of London's population, and the person has just written in the margins, non-white. So, yeah, very useful marginalia there. But you can see, right, he's got a thesis, Patrick Buchanan, in his intro. His intro is 11 pages long. We can already say that his thesis is that America is dying, right? America is decivilizing. America's coming apart. Okay, and each one of his chapters here, Where Have All the Children Gone, Catechism of a Revolution, The Coming of the Great Migrations, each one of them is a case study proving his overall thesis. One of them is about declining birth rate. One of them is about mass immigration. One of them, the war against the past. One of them is about, the attacks on our cultural history and things like that. De-Christianizing America, right? You know what that's about. The intimidated majority. So each one of these chapters it's like, well, okay, we know the overall thesis of Buchanan is that there's a dying population. And we know that the planks of his argument are these chapter headings. Now, if we really wanted to get Buchanan's take on mass immigration and how he lays out his case, we can actually go to that chapter, right? And if I was doing, let's just say, an essay on what have prominent right wingers said about mass immigration over the past 20 years, right? Well, for that project, it would be that one chapter of Buchanan that's important to me, right? If I'm writing a chapter on Buchanan, I'm going to need to read the whole thing. Does that make sense? But if I need Buchanan as part of some other project, I kind of know what this book is about already before I've even read it, and we can just kind of, well, what do we need it for? Do you understand what I'm saying, Oliver? That you don't necessarily, you can have a feel for Buchanan without even reading the damn thing. We know enough about him. We know enough about this topic. And it's just like, okay, well, it'll be interesting to see how he lays out his case. But do we actually need to sit down and read this thing from cover to cover? Like, we kind of have an idea of,
Yes, and I've found that to be particularly so when you're talking about something that has already been a set of ideas that were presented that have already been taken up to such an extent that they form sets of key assumptions. Like, you'll go thinking, oh, wow, I really need to understand Freud, and perhaps if you're looking for some very specific thing related to that discipline and Freud's own trajectory of thought, yeah, you might need to dig into it. But do you really need to read Freud to understand a basic idea that there's an unconscious that could influence you? Another one is like if you want to go and take a look at Fraser's Golden Bow. That was a groundbreaking book when it came out. It was the idea that there's, a comparative approach to folklore, myth, and religion. We all take that for granted. We swim in that water now. It's assumed by everyone. So yeah, definitely in cases, in general, as you say, and even more so in cases where whatever that line of thought is, you might find that you've already. It's less interesting to read the book for what's in it than it is to read it to understand where whole sets of your assumptions came from. And I'll throw in another piece, which is, and I've seen academics do this. Like I showed this to a professor when I was working on my own stuff, and he looked at one of my books and then he said, "I'm not going to read it because I checked the index and the bibliography, and you didn't have these two key works, so I'm just not even going to read it at all." And that has its value. It can also keep people from, hidebound academics from recognizing some new insight. But that's another way you can do it. Once you're familiar, once you've done the survey that you're already talking about, where you just sort of say, okay, here are the key planks of the development of the ideas in this discipline, or in these disciplines even, related to this given subject. Now I know what the key works are. So if I come over here, though it gets more difficult these days where, like in journal publications, they try to dissuade you from having a complete bibliography, another sign of degeneracy. But you can go and look at the bibliography simply, once you're familiar with those titles in that general sense, to see where they are in that framework.
Yeah, and there's something, I'm just looking through The Death of the West by Buchanan here. Now, obviously, this is quite a famous book. Buchanan's a famous figure, right? But I can learn all sorts of things. Bear in mind now, I have not read this book at all. I can pick up a lot of things just by looking through his footnotes or his endnotes. I was telling Mike from Imperium about this the other day. So I'm just having a look at his notes here, and I'm noticing that he's getting a lot of his stats from Jim Nelson's Black When Nations Die. Well, I've got that book. I've got that book here. And I kind of know what that says as well. I've used it for different videos I've made in the past. So I'm like, oh, right. Okay. So Buchanan is getting a lot of his primary research from Jim Nelson Black. Interesting. All right. So he's being led a little bit by the books he's reading, or what other books is he reading? Who are some of the people he keeps on coming back to? Oh, George Will. Okay. Well, he's another well-known conservative, and we can start building up a picture of like, where is Buchanan in this overall debate. even before we read the book. Does that make any sense?
Mm-hmm.
And these are some of the things that somebody like me will do even before we sit down and actually read something. And now that I'm looking at this book and just kind of flicking through it and seeing the sort of stuff he's saying, it's like, well, there's nothing really that like, this is just a distillation of stuff that a lot of guys were saying for a mass audience, right? This book has got the feel of like, well, this is going to be a New York Times bestseller, but kind of like distilled for the plebs, by a major politician who was running to be president, right?
Right.
End of. Right. So we can kind of get the substance of the book just by seeing what he's drawing on. Yes. In fact, I'm
Right.
really, yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
more useful. It's more useful in the sense that it would give you, if you wanted to go to it for that, it might be worth your time to look to see if he came up with some nice distillation for how to phrase something or present something or to get it all under a metaphor or to summarize it. But like you're talking about, once you know that it's a popularization or essentially a paraphrase of other material that's been represented, you don't really need it.
Yeah, I mean, I can see here he's drawing from James Burnham's Suicide of the West. That's another book I've got here. He quotes Trilling quite a bit. Who else does he draw from? I mean, I'm staggered by the amount that Jim Nelson Black is in these notes. So it's like, well, the main thing to go to this book would be, before I've even read it, I'm already thinking, well, maybe Patrick Buchanan had a good way of phrasing it. You could get some good pull quotes from this one, because he's a name, because it's a famous book. There's probably some great individual phrases in here, but we know that the meat of the thing is not going to be anything new. I can see Sam Francis is in the notes a lot, so we're kind of there already. We kind of know what this book says. And loads of books are like that, if you know everything else about it, anyway.
Yes, that becomes immediately apparent when you're familiar with like the few key works that kind of staked out the domain of a discipline. It's like, how much of the modern linguistic theory do you need to read if you read Saussure? You find the bright lights who first laid it out, and you'll find that a surprising amount of it often is just regurgitation of one kind, of one kind and another.
Yeah.
I had another thing I wanted to ask you about that you brought up, and I'm glad you did because I didn't have anything about it in my notes, which is about notes, specifically footnotes. For my part, I want my goddamn footnotes on my page. I don't want endnotes. I despise endnotes. I want footnotes. And I saw someone in the chat, as the stream was starting up, was talking about how they hate pages where the notes go up 3/4 of the page. I want my notes in my book. Footnotes are good. Footnotes are my friend. And to me, as I was taught very early on, footnotes are a little recognized miracle in terms of staking a claim to things in your research and in your writing that you do not at present have enough research done on in order to lock it in and really lay claim to it. But you can tentatively stake out an area for yourself without being required to produce a whole essay on it. Like, in some of my writings, I've got footnotes that have what I think of as being, like they like to say, bombshell insights, but I haven't been able to make the most of them yet. So I put them down in a footnote to say, hey, here's something I'm looking about, and now I've staked my little claim. I find that they're a wonderful place to suggest and to indicate other directions people could go without, derailing the whole thing. And I feel very strongly about the fact that they should be on the page because, God damn, man, in a chapter to have to, I don't like them when they're at the end of chapters, and I don't like them at the end of the book. I despise both of them. You end up having to stop, stick your finger in the page, remember the page you're on, go to the back, flip around to the pages for, end notes for pages 76 to 85, and then find it just really breaks up the the process. So I wonder if you have any general or particular thoughts on footnotes, endnotes, and this sort of whole subject.
Well, I have to say that I do have a preference for endnotes rather than footnotes. Although for some reason, Imperium Press have brought out Populist Delusion with footnotes, and this was pointed
Based.
out on Twitter. And I said, "Well, that's on Imperium Press because my original copy's got endnotes." And Mike from Imperium Press was said, "No, that's all on me because he prefers footnotes." So some copy editor at Imperium Press has done this without either me or Mike knowing about it. So I don't know if it was you or Oliver or so. I don't know. I don't know who got involved in the production process to turn my footnotes into endnotes. I tend to have.
Or was it endnotes into footnotes?
Yeah, they turn my endnotes into footnotes. So if you pick up Populist Delusion, it's got footnotes. So that.
And I hope everyone will pick up a copy. But now I want to hear you justify this repulsive practice.
Well, it basically, you don't want to break up the text, and there is this idea, there's this kind of weird dream that some authors and publishers have, that the footnotes are just like in case you want to know, right? So Mike from Imperium was saying that he prefers endnotes because he finds the footnotes too distracting. Okay, and I find footnotes distracting because I get obsessed and I just kind of go off and be like, "Oh, I wonder if I can find this book now." Like I said, I've picked up Patrick Buchanan's Death of the West, and I'm literally reading the notes, not the book, right?
It sounds to me like someone who claims that beautiful women have to wear veils or men will become distracted by them. Or it's like a semi-automatic pistol. If it screws up, you've got to take the magazine out. Charlemagne's gonna make fun of me. He's gonna be like, he's a Brit. He does not understand these metaphors, Oliver. But with a semi-auto, if you get a problem, you have to basically pull the magazine out, work the slide, hopefully not get in there with your fingers to pick a shell out. You have to stop everything you're doing to go to the back. Whereas this so-called distraction that you refer to, it's more like a revolver. If it doesn't work, pull the trigger again. If you don't want to see them, simply flip the page and you take up your text right where it is.
I will say though that I tend to not write much in my footnotes. I tend not to make many comments in footnotes. I tend to just use them for citations and nothing else. So there is that, I suppose.
You're just over on the dark side, is what it is.
I guess.
You've molted and moved to the next phase, which is you're so unterse that there's no need because you've just got it sorted. You've just said your piece.
I would say that I much prefer having notes to in-text citations, though. That is something I can't stand. And sometimes they...
Oh, is that like an MLA thing where they just give you a little date and whatever?
Yeah, like Smith 2001, page 5 or whatever. I don't like that. Is very irritating to me. And sometimes you'll write for a journal, or that they'll have some house style which demands that. And I learned long ago to just ignore their house style, and just hand it in using the citation style I always use, and hope that they just don't change it, or that nobody can be bothered to change it, because I do not like having those in text citations forced onto me.
Yeah, it's horrifying, and it's just the style of it is gross. Like, I don't know where it is now, but the last I had a look at the MLA, MLA style guides, they're just horrific. I mean, this I guess isn't the time or place for it, but just as a brief little to stick a flag in it or add a footnote here down at the bottom. Har har. It's worth looking at the subversion, the program, the methodical, intentional, and systematic program of subversion inherent in the foisting of these different style guidelines on us. And MLA certainly seems to be up there at the top. You know, I was always a fan of the University of Chicago style. But I suppose there, you know, I mean, and then there's disgusting shit like AP, you know, but, you know, what do you think about these style guidelines in general?
Yeah, I mean, I just default to you. I mean, it's interesting because Patrick Buchanan is also using the same style that I use, which is, I think it's called HMRA. Is it HM? Is that what it's called?
I don't even know it.
It's really similar to Chicago, and there's also one called Oxford style. They're all much of a muchness, you know. It's where it's like the name, then the book in italics, the place, the publication, the year of publication, close the brackets, page, full stop, or period, as you guys would say. Like, to me, that's a reference. And whenever you call that style is, I think that should be the universal style. But you know, other ones are available.
Yes, sadly, lamentably, lamentable. So what do you think? Well, two things. I have one last question for you that's a general one, and then I want to open it to you if there's anything that you wanted to talk about that didn't, since I've been, you know, running back and forth like a sheepdog, probably corralling the conversation in ways that weren't necessary. So, yeah, any thoughts that weren't covered that you would, or ideas or themes that weren't covered? But before that, anything you'd want to say on outlining?
Yeah. Have an introduction and a conclusion, and then the stuff in the middle. I mean, the outline should write itself. It should be a, you know, if it's a chapter, if it's an essay, it should have about 6 parts. Okay, and you know, the first one, the second, and the last one are always the same. The intro and the conclusion. The intro is a set of promises. I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna say this. The conclusion just marries up with the intro. I said that, you know, remember that stuff I said I was going to do? I did it, and you know, here's me making the same argument again. Just do that every single time. You have an essay. That is what I told hundreds of students over and over again for 10 years. Then what else?
So really, basically, you're saying it's the classic: tell them what you're going to tell them, tell them what you told them.
Exactly. And I mean, everybody who reads my stuff says, "Oh, well, you know, he's such a." I think a lot of people say I'm a very clear writer. Okay, I have quite a plain style. If you do foundations of writing, you know, I'm going to tell you to be, don't use more words than necessary. Use simpler words rather than fancier words, and so on and so forth. But also, you should have like a studio anchor when you're writing. There's a moment where you're like you're the studio anchor. You know, oh, thank you very much for that. That was interesting. You know, you've just told us about this, and now it's time to turn to this thing. Okay, they call it signposting, right? And everybody
Right, but
feels
forming a ligature between your elements.
everybody feels lame writing those things, but I have never seen a reader complain about them. You know, in this, you know, this book has got 10 chapters. Chapter 1 says this, chapter 2 says this, chapter 3 says this, chapter 4 says this, chapter 5 says, you know, just say it. And then there's going to be a conclusion at the end. And the conclusion says, oh, do you remember in this book, chapter 1 said that, chapter 2 said that, chapter 3. I mean, it seems really redundant when you're writing it, but a lot of people, that will be the stuff that he end up reading, and it's helpful to them, you know.
Yeah, I get a lot of that. And it can be frustrating when you're dealing with someone on the other side who is like, why do you keep repeating yourself? You know, but generally it would seem you can strike a balance with that where you are providing the sort of bridge moments in the song to carry people over to the other sections. and not leave them high and dry without being too not terse.
Exactly. And the other thing I would say is leave the intro to last. If I wrote a piece not long ago, I wrote a Carlyle piece for a well-known magazine, let's just say, that should be coming out soon. And I went into it without a plan, because sometimes we don't always follow our own advice, right? And I kept on, I started about 12 times. And in the end, the entire piece is me just trying to start it. So I've got, when you write like an opening paragraph, I ended up having a 2,500 word article where I didn't actually get started. It was just me trying to start. So then I was like, oh, right, I've run out of words already and I haven't started. So I then had to go back and try to put new frames on that, a scaffolding around it that made it seem like I'd planned it that way all along.
They call that turd polishing. Yes.
Yeah, but I mean, sometimes you have to do that because it needed to be in, and
I'm joking.
I would do it, and I was getting paid, So I was just like, but if you ever read that Thomas Carlyle article, you can remember those lucky few who are listening to us that it's actually just literally 12 intros tacked together and then framed nicely by me at the end. So yeah, that happens sometimes as well.
Indeed. Yes. That whole business of writing the introduction last is really kind of it reflects that basic thing of I would have written you a shorter note, but I didn't have time. The final distillation really must and should come. I mean, I'm sure it can be otherwise if you're struck by some kind of profound insight and you've just got it from there on, and you could just write the entire book. It's probably happened to you. It hasn't happened to me for a book, but it's happened with articles where you just struggle, and then bam, you've got it. So go, but the distillation really does generally come at the end for obvious reasons, at which point, with the benefit of the hindsight across the entire project, you should then turn to the introduction.
Something else I do as well, which is that you can have like plans laid out and outlines. Do you remember I was saying I've got all the quotes lined up and I know where they're going to go and all that sort of stuff. But I tend to, as I'm going along there, and I'll pick up something and I'll be like, hey, that would have been really good there. Oh, right. But I finished it now. Anyway, I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna go and put it in. And in fact, that's where about 99% of mistakes enter the text, is those last minute changes that you make. Invariably, because you'll end up doing it at like 5 a.m. as well. But invariably, that's where a typo will enter in as well, where you're going back and trying to crowbar in this new thing that you found.
Yes, I've also found that I when I do that sort of thing, to go back and add some dimension that I thought was missing when I reread this section, I'll very often come back and read it yet again another time later and see that, oh, I just forgot that one page earlier I had already covered it. So it gets more and more difficult to go back in and try to do a little bit of surgery on something that's complete. But I guess that raises the question of revisions and editing over time, and the question of whether you would ever want to go back and touch any of these previous works you've done. It sounds to me like you're the kind of scholar that's, when you're done with it, you're done.
Yeah, I would never go back and change them now. I mean, I would give one tip though. If you have some like last minute thing that occurs to you, do not put that thing in the conclusion. The chapter, the essay is not a magic trick, right? It's not like, oh, we come all this way. But here's this thing I was saving to the end. Just stick it up in the penultimate paragraph if you can, because the conclusion should have no surprises.
Actually, that's a very, very important point, because I myself suffered from this, and I'm actually in the past, and I'm actually now talking with a friend of mine who's not an academic, but he's made a very, very interesting and exciting discovery about the origin of a musical form, and he's trying to lay out his book. And he's very much trying to set it up like a magic trick or like a work of fiction, where there's suddenly this exciting, unexpected turn at the end where he revealed that it's, and that, I'm glad you touched on this because that's a very, very important point. You don't want surprises. If there's going to be a surprise, the whole book has to be one from the beginning.
Yeah, it's not a mad. I mean, just like I can pick up Buchanan's Death of the, what's it called? The Death of the West. I know what the book's about. You open it up from the very first page. This is going to be his theme. The country's going to shit. It's going to shit in these 6 different areas. Each chapter is going to be on an area of how it's going to shit. And his conclusion is, yes, the country is going to shit. Unless we do something to change it. Vote for me. Right? Bestseller. It's not like, we thought the country was going badly, but look at this factoid that I was keeping hidden for 7 chapters that I've whipped out in the conclusion. It's just, you just don't do that in nonfiction. It's just a different genre, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, it also seems that there's kind of a parallel with the old thing about a collection of songs versus an album. You can't put your finger on what it is that makes it all an album rather than a collection of songs. But Wish You Were Here, it's an album. Hunky Dory, it's an album. You could see the different journeys that the creator was going on at that time, and somehow they all fit together. The voice, the musical elements they were experimenting with, whatever. Mm-hmm. You have to have that kind of coherence with the work as a whole, so that it's the chapters, like tracks, form an album rather than just a loose collection of songs.
Yeah, and this is one of my little bugbears actually with a lot of academic books, because a lot of academic books are secretly not books. They are just collections of greatest hit essays that have appeared in different journals with an intro tacked onto the front. And there's a lot of scholarly books like that.
Because, they're horrible, especially the group ones. Will there be one editor and 7 different people submitted, and it's like all over the fucking place?
Yeah, collection of essays, right? There's always some really lame attempt to tie them all together to a particular theme.
Always post facto.
Yes. So that's worth bearing in mind as well. That's a different type of book. What we're talking about is what they call a monograph. A book written on a particular topic as an album, if you want, not a greatest hits. But in research, those greatest hit books can be handy, right? Because often they'll be the only place that you'll be able to find an essay. Especially if they appeared in some obscure journal that's behind a paywall or long out of print. I mean, fuck
but
me.
From that perspective, though, the individual essay itself is what's of interest by its nature, not the
whole book. Yeah. But occasionally, rarely, but occasionally, you could go to that edited collection and find like another chapter that is of interest as well. But it's very
if you had a good editor who was really out there hungry looking for some insight, yeah, it can happen. Yeah, but for the most part, it seems to me like one of those things where you got to buy shit in bulk on eBay because they know that people only want these 2 things, and so they have to sell all 15, in order to get rid of the other garbage.
It's often a way for young scholars to get published. Their first publication will be a book chapter in that way.
Yeah, indeed, it was from my first academic publication. Yeah, it was in a selection of those essays, and I played hell because I worked with the editors too, trying, like you were talking about, to put an umbrella over all of it, so that it had that consistency. And I guess that's the main point here, really, that you were hammering on, and I think it's a very good one. It should be a whole, and the cover should tell you what you're going to get in it, and the table of contents should lay out how it works. And the index should be, allow you to find what themes were tapped upon, and the bibliography should be truly representative of what you relied on to create it. Because if and only if it's built that way, then you can do what you're talking about, which is where you can do a preliminary read of the book without having to read it.
I can already tell you what Prophets of Doom is about. A bunch of guys in history rejected the notion of progress had a different shape of history in mind, a more cyclical shape of history, and generally they see the direction of travel as being a negative one. They see decline rather than progress. Here are like 10 of them. Each chapter is one of them, and the conclusion was like, yeah, they were all miserable fucks. That's the end. Bye. But it's just like, I mean, you know, this is what non-fiction books are a lot of the time. So
Yes, but I think also you just underscored again that it's your own crap, in the sense that this is something you are going to eat and digest because of your own quite personal reasons, whatever they might be. Who cares, right?
yeah.
You decided that you wanted to go find out about those things. And you said, it would seem, well, how can I monetize and share this? Because it's not just monetize it, jokes about selling carpets or whatever aside. If you didn't do that, it wouldn't be shared. The result of your efforts to understand a thing wouldn't be passed on to others when you're done.
What's the reason? Is to get those ideas into the discourse in some way. That's typically why somebody writes a book, right? They want to try to. So with this populist delusion that's just come out now, my real aim was to get everybody in our spheres and wider spheres, and even the wider political, I mean, ideally like Tucker Carlson's researchers and other people like that, even Donald Trump, right? Not that Donald Trump would ever read, but in my ideal world, there'd be some little minion of Donald Trump's sitting and reading about Giantano Mosca and Alfredo Pareto, right? Now this will never make it into any kind of it'll never make it on air, but it's
it might make it onto Stephen Miller's bookshelf.
Right, but it's important for those guys to be thinking in this way, right? And I think I've already managed to, I just watch around. I was randomly watching Ed Dutton and Richard Spencer one night, and Spencer Dutton, who I know, reviewed my book. Just casually mentioned in passing Mosca. I'm like, well, I'm glad that now those guys have got that thinking as part of their discourse.
You've turned your flying monkeys loose, and they are
Yeah, and
swarming
they're just
everywhere.
like they'll permeate the field. And my kind of once that's done, my work is done when it comes to that book. And now, like as the David Bowie, I'm on to the next thing, which is I want to take down the notion of progress, capital P progress, and ask the question like, well, how is it that you get people from literally Jeremiah and Heraclitus to, people writing now who think things have been going badly, right? How can there be progress if there were, guys in the 12th century who thought the country was going to the dogs? Why is this a permanent feature? I think it's an interesting question, right? So that'll be the next thing I want to try to overturn, I guess, which is I think a lot of people have a default. Even if they claim not to, they still default to thinking in terms of progress, and I would like to undo that. But yes, at some
Smash
point
them,
I'll start writing it.
crush them all, and spit upon their notions of progress. Well, are there any other angles of this that you wanted to mention, or perhaps some huge looming obvious thing that I failed to take into account or even bring up?
Yes, opposition, people from the other side, ideological opponents can be useful. So you don't just need to read one side of an issue. It's sometimes important to read the opposition as well, because they can pinpoint where the weaknesses are in an argument. They can raise things that need to be addressed. They can, I mean, in a really weird way, right? SJW scholars can actually pinpoint all the base material for you. Does that sound strange? It's just like, I mean, like how can I put it? Like let's just say a woke scholar reading Carlyle will show you all the bits where he's racist, whereas somebody who's trying to rehabilitate him might try to hide that stuff. You know what I mean?
Right. You don't have to wander around the fields. You just send your truffled dog out, and they'll come back
Exactly.
with all the good, all the tasty bits.
Yeah, and it's just like, oh, that's good. Um, you find this in any field as well. It's like, well, the Marxists trying to critique Ludwig von Mises. They'll ferret out the bit where he defended fascism. It's like, oh, thanks for that. That's a good that's a good thing to know. So it's I think there can be a tendency sometimes for people to just stay within their ideological bubble, but when you're doing research, it's often extremely useful to consider what they were saying on the other side of the issue and what arguments they made and what they highlighted as well. So yes.
And of course, that's going to be mandated within the normal academic training because it's the usual thing where, in order to place one new grain of sand to top the mountain, you must first show that you have grasped all the other damn grains of sand before you put the new one, or they won't accept it.
Yeah, I'll tell you. Sometimes that opposition research can actually be enlightening as well. Somebody in the chat said the ADL recommendation list. I mean, go through the ADL's glossary of extremist rhetoric one day. I find out loads of stuff I didn't know in there. I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. Thanks ADL. Do you know what I mean? So
right.
yeah,
AA's patented inversion technique. You put on the glasses, and suddenly, the Sith Lords are the good guys. So yeah, apparently that works in many fields of life to which you've applied it.
indeed.
I mean, you were just going with Game of Thrones, right? I mean, you're just going for a redo.
Exactly.
Indeed. Okay. Well, then, do you have any other things that you want to shill at the end? I mean, your shill list actually is, it's a prolific shill list.
Yeah, I would say if you were really interested in this stream, buy the Foundations of Research course, where I go into some, I actually give some like very specific things that you can do to speed up your work as well. Because this is the thing that's been driving me nuts about Mrs. AA, right? I've literally every night I've been saying, use my knowledge, I beg you, but she won't. She has to do it her own way, and it takes her hours and hours and days and weeks to do like one little essay, whereas if you really knew what you're doing, you can box clever, you can work efficiently, and you can get the work of 10 men done in 10 hours if you know what you're doing. But it's about having like cultivating good habits and being like ruthlessly efficient in how you process research. You can spend an hour researching inefficiently, or you can spend that same time, you can get so much work done in just 1 hour if you really put your mind to it. So get Foundations of Research. That's what I want to shill today.
Yeah, and you have some new Foundations series coming out soon, right? Have those been publicly announced yet?
There's the Foundations of Entrepreneurship by Ferro has come out, so that's another good one that people should get.
And was there one with art on the way or something like that, or is that?
Yeah, well, yes. I don't think that's been announced yet, but
sorry.
There is one.
Oh,
there is
shit.
one on the way. There is one on the way.
Yes. Excellent. Well, please, everyone, check that out. That's all over at the Academic Agency. Of course, you can obtain Academic Agent's new book, The Populist Delusion, out from Imperium Press. And there's all sorts of places you can follow Academic Agent. For those in the know, he's over on Twitter. And, of course, there's his channel and all the rest on Popular Opinions, the Cigar Stream, and all those those mighty offerings. So yeah, thank you very, very much, AA, for coming on, and I wish you the best with continuing to your course of world domination.
There's one more tip I want to give as well, just before we get out of here.
Please.
When you've said everything you have to say about something, stop.
Yeah. I'm just over here. I'm struggling. I'm slobbering. I'm clawing at myself because my terseness, my lack of terseness. Yes. But the best way I ever heard it put was start strong, because it was from dance performances. Come out there, start strong. And when it's over, close strong and walk the fuck off. It works very, very well for relationships too. Start strong, close strong. It'll cover up any amount of nonsense there in the middle. But therefore, to take my own advice, since I just screwed up the point at which I should have cut the stream right after A spoke. Thank you all for joining us, and come on back around next time. We'll see you all soon. And yeah, get out.